Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon, goedemiddag. It's great to be with fellow South African libertarians. I'm going to make perhaps a few points about the trade war, and please feel free to interject and ask follow-up questions. I'm happy to talk about generally politics and economics in the United States and its effect on the world. But basically, when Trump started going after China, I think that a lot of people were surprised that he was serious about it. But very quickly, he has developed a consensus, bipartisan consensus around the China issue. And more people now than before accept now Trump's basic contention that the trade relationship and the economic relationship between the United States and China was unhealthy and something had to be done about it. Now, I think that those of us who are free traders would have preferred if Trump made greater use of the WTO and perhaps poured some more resources into the good functioning of the WTO rather than sanctions. I think that most of us would have preferred if the United States signed up to the Trans-Pacific Partnership with like-minded countries, which would create a pressure on China to sort of behave better when it comes to trade with the rest of the world. But we are where we are. There now is a consensus in Washington that China has to change its way of doing business if it is going to be allowed to trade freely with free market democracies around the world. I can hear you.
Hello, Marian. This is Dave Stewart. We've met several times in Washington and other places. I'm worried about...
Lovely to see you.
Yeah, I'm worried that the United States might be entering a new era of isolationism. How deep is the American commitment, do you think, to NATO? And to what extent do you think that this is a reflection of reality, that the United States will be pulling back from different world theaters?
Okay, so let's start with economics, because obviously isolationism has both an economic and a geopolitical component. When it comes to economics, I'm a little bit worried, but I'm not panicking. The United States would be hit much harder, and the economic consequences of the China war would have been much stronger if the United States decided to stop doing business with all poor countries. But as it stands, the United States is going mostly after China, but our trade relationship with other poor countries such as India, Bangladesh, Thailand, and many other places continues to go relatively well. And this is important because once multinational corporations decide that China's labor is too expensive, but also that its trade relationship with the rest of the world is far from certain, they may migrate into other low-cost economies and therefore continue to provide the global economy with cheap goods, which are necessary for the global trade flows to continue and for Western living standards to be maintained. Now, when it comes to the geopolitical aspect of the Trump administration, I think that we are discovering that the presidency is much less powerful, especially in this respect, than we assume. Look, Trump may talk a big game on withdrawing troops from around the world. And let's not forget that out of the 190 countries in the world, the United States has a military presence in about 170 countries. But it's very difficult for the United States to pull back, um, even from small conflicts like Syria. And it is very difficult to see the United States withdrawing from NATO simply because the backlash would be so hard, so ferocious from what we have come to call permanent Washington. And by permanent Washington, I mean think tanks, I mean a variety of quangos, both mainstreams, both political parties. There is a tiny minority of congressmen and senators who would like to withdraw from NATO, but the general consensus amongst the foreign policy establishment is that we should remain in. And I just don't see Trump withdrawing from these transatlantic commitments, even during his most mad days.
Hi, Marian. Ivo Vechter. I've got two questions for you. One is on the impeachment proceedings against Trump. I've always had the idea that if the Democrats were going to do that, seeing as they would not succeed, in the Senate at least, that they should probably do it right at the height of the election campaign in 2020. Do you get the feeling over there that by moving on impeachment now, they're sort of wasting their ammo? And what do you think the impact on Trump will be? Will it strengthen him or weaken him in the election? That's question one. And then secondly, the Democratic Party, how strong is their socialist wing, their Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders wing? Is the Democratic Party genuinely moving strongly to the left, or do you think that once the election comes around, they will once again recenter, actually nominate someone towards the center, and fight on a more centrist ticket?
So there was a bit of an echo, but I assume that you are asking about the impeachment and about socialism in the Democratic Party.
Yes.
Okay. So on impeachment, I think that the strategy right now is to try to discover as many unpleasant things about Trump's past as can be possibly discovered, so as to weaken him before the election. So everybody understands that he's probably not going to be convicted in the Senate, but the impeachment process may have its uses, galvanizing the Democratic base, but also dragging into the limelight some of Trump's business dealings, perhaps some of his past tax problems, and for that you really need a body in government which is empowered to gather all of this evidence. And so I suspect that that's part of it. And of course, the base of the Democratic Party is screaming for it and desires it. But fundamentally, I just see it as a process of weakening Trump before the election. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I was actually asking, what do you think the ultimate effect will be? Will it weaken him, that they're proceeding now, as opposed to later on in 2020? Or will it actually strengthen him because it will galvanize his own base as well?
I think that right now, smart money has to be on the weakening. We are already seeing the polls being much more open to impeachment because people are simply finding out more and more about the sorts of ways in which he behaves and in which he functions, and also the way that he responds to it is very often a little bit unhinged. And I think that a lot of people are simply getting tired of the drama that's happening in Washington every day. I mean, the sorts of things that we are seeing, and I'm speaking as a non-partisan, would have finished any other president off a long time ago. And basically, there are new things that the country is learning about the administration every day, which, 2 or 3 things. It's even difficult to keep up with the news cycle because there is just so much coming down the pipeline. I think that, I basically think that it will weaken. Conversely, if he does get removed, which I don't expect will happen, that could strengthen him. But again, I don't think that's going to happen. I think that a much more important determinant of what happens in next year's elections will be whom the Democrats nominate as their presidential candidate. So I don't think that, so I think that's much more important, and that sort of ties into your second question. Look, the Democrats are split between wanting a centrist candidate who can appeal to blue-collar workers, more conservative workers in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, states like that, Wisconsin, and then choosing a candidate who is more aspirational and appeals to their ideological purity test. So you have obviously Warren and Sanders, who are much more on the left than, say, for example, Biden or Klobuchar or Buttigieg. Now, the thing to remember is that the base of the Democratic Party, the kinds of people who vote in the primary elections, tend to be further to the left, which is precisely what we are seeing, is that Warren is increasing in popularity. Presumably she's going to mop up many of the votes which are currently going for Bernie Sanders because he's getting quite old and he just had a heart attack. And so I think it's a toss-up right now between her and Biden. But I wouldn't be too surprised if Democrats end up with Warren as the presidential candidate, and that actually increases Trump's chances of re-election dramatically, because